This is Bruce McDonald, and welcome to Academics of PA. This week I have Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan, both from Georgetown University, with me. So, first, I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Both of the two of you were the names that have come up the most often in terms of people that our audience actually wanted to see on the podcast, so I'm excited about actually being able to have you.
Great, thank you.
I will start off, you are probably an anomaly within academia, and if I'm wrong on this, I apologize, but I just want to kind of double check. The two of you are married or at least in a relationship, correct?
We are married.
Yes.
Okay.
And we are also in a relationship. Both of those things at the same time.
That's always good. Well, the reason I ask is it's not uncommon to be in an academic relationship, but it is probably a little bit more uncommon to be in one where actually doing projects like working on a book together with somebody. So what I wanted to do...
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go.
Well, so there are other examples. I think I would just sort of clarify that you know what, I'm just going to stop. Why don't you just ask the question?
So what I was going to say, or ask, now I got to think of how I was going to ask it. I guess kind of what's the backstory there of the two of you? How did, I know you both met when you were at Syracuse, at least it's my assumption. So, kind of how did the two of you both get into the fields that you got in? How did that relationship between the two of you kind of emerge? And then what's it actually like working with your partner in the context of an academic setting? I know it's a hefty question all at once, but...
So we were PhD students at Syracuse at the same time, and I was in the public administration program. Pam was in sociology, but we took some overlapping classes. So I think we met in a qualitative methods class that Jody Sanford had organized. So, yay for qualitative methods. And then, I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, initially, we didn't have that much in common in terms of our research. And so we sort of did parallel areas of research. And it wasn't until I think we'd probably been married for 7 or 8 years, so maybe 10 years after we met, we found some connections between our two areas of research. And so we started to work together at that point.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I had been more direct policy oriented. So I did a lot of work around Social Security, Medicare, social welfare policy, with a central kind of driving interest in how policy affects inequality. And I also do a lot of health research and aging research, also all kind of focused around the themes of inequality. And then we just happened to be having a conversation about the kinds of barriers people face when they're trying to access social welfare policies. And that was sort of the start of where we realized we kind of had overlap.
Yeah, in some ways, there's always this discussion between policy people and people who study administration about how do you work together to think about the connection between implementation. And that's often discussed at some superficial level, and then there isn't a deeper follow-up conversation. But when you're married to someone, you can have those long-term conversations where you're iterating about the topic over a number of years. And so we had the chance to do that. And so I think it's partly nice to have someone who understands the areas of research that you work in and to talk about those things together, and then very gradually see ways in which they actually connect.
That kind of makes sense. I think about my experience with different relationships I've had over the years. One of the problems that usually emerges is a lack of understanding of really what I do. And most people just chop it up to say that I'm an economist. I'm like, well, I'm not really an economist. So definitely having someone that's around you that you can have that understanding and explanation with is a plus.
Yeah, and I also think being married, I mean, there are other examples of married couples with overlapping research interests, and not that I'm comparing Don and I, but for example, the recent econ Nobel laureates are married to each other,
Mm-hmm.
and their research agenda has paralleled each other, I guess, over time. But I think generally, most people with long-term collaborations are friends. I certainly have a bunch of friends that I collaborate closely with. And in some ways, I don't think it's all that different in terms of what the interaction is like when you're working together. It's just a bit like working with a close friend.
Do you end up with kind of instances or opportunities where you vehemently disagree, and when it's a friend, you can call them back later, you can spend a little time working on a different project, but when it's your partner, you don't really have that same escape?
We definitely disagree on things, and I think we've probably figured out our comparative strengths over time. And so in some cases, we'll just defer to the other person. But there will be, issues like how do you frame this problem? Or how do we talk about this theory where we'll disagree? And, I think it has pluses and minuses because you're not going to censor yourself in the same way you might do with someone that is a friend or a colleague. You're just going to sort of be straightforward about what you think is wrong with the other person. But uh, I think the key thing is, we understand that these are disagreements about work that don't then fall into sort of how we treat each other as partners in a marriage.
And there haven't been it's not like we've had a ton of like disagreements. In some ways, it really is like collaborating with someone. I mean, the way that I've increasingly thought about it is it's a sort of interdisciplinary collaboration. And so I'll defer to him when it comes to things that are really more central, like framing for a PA article, for example. I'm going to defer to him on that. That's like his area. But when it verges into, sort of inequality, or where the audience might be more policy oriented, then I have a sense that I have a better ability to kind of frame something around that. So it feels more like my interdisciplinary collaborations. Generally, all of my work is with people from different disciplines, and so it feels that way to me, basically.
I think disagreements, this is probably generally true with other sorts of collaborations, tend to come up in areas which are really sort of new or not well mapped out, right? And so when we started writing the book on administrative burdens, the areas where we disagreed tended to be on issues like how do we talk about the theory, right? Because that was novel terrain. Whereas, if Pam is writing a chapter on Social Security, she just knows that much better than I do. But the flip side of those disagreements is that it's absolutely essential to have that dialogue, and sometimes that disagreement, in order to further each one of you, for whatever your prior beliefs were, to think about things more creatively. And so that is part of the process.
It really works. I mean, and generally, this is true in my mind with interdisciplinary collaborations. I mean, one real advantage to it is precisely that you see the weaknesses in the argument. Like when you're used to thinking about things in from a particular disciplinary vantage point, to get challenged by someone who doesn't think about the same thing that way is actually really useful, because you identify weaknesses and flaws in your thinking. So I generally have found the work gets stronger when you do that, in part because you get this different vantage point, sometimes on the same substantive area, but having that push about why you think a certain way about it really helps to target your argument better.
You both certainly have your own independent research agendas. When you're thinking about starting a new project, whether it's together or whether it's going to be something that is independent, how do you go about choosing the subject is, or even if you're taking on a co-author, how would you kind of approach thinking about what co-authors you're going to work with?
So we have a couple of sort of projects where we've worked together. One has been, and this is probably less well known to a public administration audience, but we've also done papers on voting and the relationship between health and voting. And that partly grew organically out of a time when I was working with some political scientists in Wisconsin. Pam was running something called the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study, which is still the PI of. And I knew that they had voting data in that data set that we could work on together. And so there it was sort of a matter of, I had a question with some colleagues. I thought we could answer that question much better by collaborating with Pam. And it was sort of a very organic um, relationship that flowed from there. I think with the administrative burden stuff, and Pam can comment on this, that was much more built out of our life experiences and reflecting on those experiences as we also talked about what we were doing research on. And so, there were parts of that were, for example, for me being an immigrant and dealing with the paperwork costs of applying to become a citizen. Um, and we also have a child who has a disability, and so that in itself generates a lot of administrative burdens when you're trying to get support from government. And so we had many conversations that were really part of a reflection of life that we were living and how we thought our research could speak to or really didn't speak to those experiences. And so those were sort of two quite different paths. I think the first path could have happened with any other colleague on campus, whereas the second path probably did depend much more on our personal experiences overlapping with our professional expertise and having conversations about those in a way that I don't know would have happened with just some other colleague.
Yeah, I mean, the voting thing was sort of interesting. We had added, actually, I think we'd done that with Barry, though, is the thing, that we'd added voting data to this sort of 60-year-long longitudinal study. And yeah, somewhere in the process there, we all started talking about different things to do with the data. It's hard to, honestly, with a lot of projects where there's they just sort of a merge or something. You're like chatting with people, especially at a place like Wisconsin. The breadth of the social sciences there, and there's a lot of interaction among social scientists, like interdisciplinary interactions among social scientists at Wisconsin. And so it's just super easy. I have so many projects where I look back and I actually really can't remember what conversation it was or what, you could, anyway.
Part of what I think is interesting is that you both kind of have these publication records that aren't strictly in one very kind of tight-knit controlled area. And I think when we train PhD students in this day and age, one of the things that departments like to do is say kind of stick to the area because that's what gets you known. So I think kind of hearing how you choose, the process that you go through of thinking about what projects you're going to work on is kind of interesting. And I like, Pam, that you said that you really don't remember because there are so many things that just kind of happen to come along.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably the extreme version of the not sticking to one particular topic or disciplinary. I mean, I'm a sociologist by training. I think the very consistent thread throughout all of my research is that it focuses around inequality. But beyond that, it's much broader, I think, than than most of the people I know. And it's not, it's partly a function of just, I'm interested in a lot of things, and I'm pretty curious about a lot of things. And I really enjoy the process of learning new areas. Like I really enjoy that process of trying to like figure things out. And I really like working with people. I like working with sociologists, but I really like working as well with people who are not sociologists. And so all of those things, I think, explain a little bit the diversity of the areas that I've worked in. And that, what I will often say to students when I talk to them is that, on the one hand, I would never recommend my approach to anyone because it can be difficult to pull something like that off, just strategically, because it's more time consuming, right? Like if you get to know one area really well, you both can publish more rapidly in that area, as well as you get to know people much more quickly than who are the people who write your letters for tenure and all those sorts of things. But that said, I would not trade what I've done for anything. To me, the major advantage to being an academic at a university is that you get to decide every day what you're going to do with your time. I mean, you have obviously some constraints, but more than any other job that I'm aware of, we really kind of, you're the master of your own domain. And so I feel like if you give that up, if you start making a lot of choices, particularly about your research, that are more strategic than they are driven by what you're interested in, you're kind of losing a major advantage to the jobs that we have, or you're giving up a major advantage to the jobs you have.
Yeah, I think for listeners who are less familiar with Pam and might know her only for her work on administrative burden, she's definitely understating the sort of breadth of her expertise here. So her dissertation dealt with Social Security, and she's also done work on classic political science questions about voting, questions of aging and health. And so she's published in places like the Gerontologist, and more recently on sociogenomics. And so the interaction between people's genetic backgrounds and the environment in which they operate. And so I think she has an unusually large breadth of interests. Um, for me, I think my breadth is a little bit more modest in that it generally all falls into public administration or at least the edges of political science. And so my PhD started with performance management, and that's been one topic I've sort of worked on throughout. And interestingly, that wasn't the topic that I had set out to work on. Initially I was interested more in international development and human resource issues, but my PhD advisor wanted someone who would work on that topic for a project that she had funded. Um, and so I stuck with that. And I think it is generally good advice to students to think about, what's your identity before you go up for tenure. It's easy for people who are writing your letters if you have one or two clearly defined areas that you've really exploited pretty well and you become known for that topic. On the other hand, it can take 5 years between when you start initiating a research question and seeing it come out in a published volume somewhere, right? And so one of the things that sustains you and keeps you interested in that topic over time is that you just care inherently about the topic. And so what motivated me to do different things, like to start studying elections and ultimately voting, or take a sideline to do disaster response, were things that I found interesting in real life. So I started studying elections after the 2000 election and the Florida recount. That sort of became more interesting to me. I started becoming interested in disaster response after Hurricane Katrina, and the administrative burden topics, as I mentioned, sort of flowed directly from some personal life experiences. And so one of the beauties of academia is that you have the freedom to pursue these other interests, but it's also a motivating factor that you're actually interested in these topics, right? And at some point, I think I got a little bit burned out after I published my book on performance management in about 2008. And I was really looking for other things to do. Um, so it is actually healthy, I think, in the long run to have a couple of slightly different topics that you're interested in, because if you start to feel like you've in a rut with one, you can always devote more of your energy to another before you come back to the first.
I'll throw myself under the bus a little bit because I think I kind of fall into the same category where I like having a breadth of different things that I'm working on, and I get remarkably curious about a large number of different things that kind of come along. For instance, I do predominantly budget and finance, but I have a friend that does a lot of PSM stuff, and so I have a selection of PSM papers, even though that seems a little weird to me. At the same time, though, I end up with kind of a massive list of ideas for different papers that I either try to manage or try to work on, but it's now long enough that realistically, if I accomplish that list, I could probably retire tomorrow because there's enough things on there that would, fill whatever expectation of publishing you could ever have for a career. My difficulties kind of going forward and thinking about, well, I have all these different options of things to work on. Which one do I actually want to focus on at this moment? So I guess kind of my question is, given that you're both kind of looking around and seeing what's kind of going on in society to kind of help drive some of what you focus on, how do you actually narrow down to the ones that you're going to focus on?
Yeah, for me, at any given moment, I'm sort of more focused on one thing than the other. Do you know what I mean? So, for example,
Right.
right now, I do have a few things, a certain selection of things that are focused around the administrative burden theme, and particularly, just for example, I'm really interested about developing a clear kind of theoretical frame to think about race inequality in the administrative burden frame. And so I think uh, that's sort of part of where I'm really devoting my energy to there. I also, do the sort of aging and inequality. And so I have a big NIH funded project around um, inequality basically in dementia. So meaning like socioeconomic differences and who ends up with dementia in later life. And so I have some key papers that I'm working on, as well as data collection that I'm working on with that. And so it's like I have these sort of three areas where I'm doing work. And then within those three areas, I sort of focus on what I think are the most kind of important of the ideas or the most interesting of the ideas that I have, on your list, right? Like what I would generally say though is it's true. You're right. Like I think it's taken me some time to figure out how to prioritize and how to think through both sort of practical and interest-based choices about what I'm prioritizing. But what I would for sure say is that you're in a much better position to have too long of a list than to be someone who can't figure out what to do next. I mean, I think in the scheme of things, right?
Right.
Yeah, so one of the pieces that stuck with me from grad school was reading about organizational learning from James March and the distinction between devoting your energy between exploration and exploitation, and the idea that certain amount of your time is spent investing in new topics, new areas that you develop some expertise in, and the payoff might take a little while to come, but eventually it comes. Eventually you get to the point where you can exploit that expertise, and so the marginal cost of each additional paper becomes much lower. Um, and so I think, it's sort of helpful if you're a PhD student or a junior faculty member to think about that, right? So some investments that you make should have these long-term payoffs, um, but you can't have a portfolio where it's entirely exploration and you're not exploiting some area of knowledge that you've previously developed, right? So I think at any given point in time, I'm probably thinking about how am I exploiting something that I already know something about, like the performance management stuff. Um, and at some point, I'm also trying to think about what's the next thing I need to spend more of my time thinking about. Right now, I think I'm spending more time on the administrative burden stuff, partly because it's very attractive to interact with other scholars who are excited about the topic. And so there's also a little bit of a demand function there when you sort of see people who are interested in what you're doing and want to help build out that area of research, then it's incredibly motivating. You want to do everything you can to sort of help create a structure of research that people find helpful. Um, so part of this is also just, not just what is exciting and interesting for the broader world, which is certainly a motivating factor, but also what your colleagues are receptive to, and what aspects of your work do they really seem to respond to. And I think that sort of draws you like a magnet to invest more time in that work if you're getting professional feedback that people find what you're doing helpful.
I also think that when I look back, right, there's pre-tenure and post-tenure. And so what I did pre-tenure was less diverse. I mean, I had sort of policy inequality and health inequality, and there was actually quite a bit of overlap. So even, for example, when they were figuring out who would write letters, there were like obvious people who kind of knew both parts of my work, say. Post tenure, though, that's one of the things. You just have some more freedom to do that exploratory kind of work. And I actually think, for me at least, some of my more novel and interesting work has come post tenure because I've had the time to invest in it and to take risks. So the thing that Don mentioned earlier, I have this piece coming out in the American Sociological Review, which is effectively showing how gender inequality kind of can alter things that we might think are largely influenced by genetics. So it's a paper about gender inequality and aging and so on and so forth. That paper, from start to finish, effectively took me about, I don't know, 8 years, because there was data collection. I did the data collection. There was grant writing to get the money to do the genetic analysis. And there's it took forever, right? But that's one of the great luxuries about tenure. You can invest in that way and take those kind of risks. And sometimes I think your best work can come out of that.
Thinking of your typical paper, about how long does it normally take for you to complete a paper from the time you come up with the idea to the time you actually finish it?
Boy, that is a hard question.
It is,
Well,
yeah.
how about I'll give you a second to think, and I'll kind of give you the background as to why I ask. I teach a course in research design, which is basically how you write the front half of a paper. And it's a class that all the first year PhD students in my department take. And we were sitting in class last week, and they were very kind of demotivated a little bit that it's taking an entire semester to do just the front half of a single paper. And I was trying to explain to them, like, no, they can take a while.
Yeah. So the answer is it depends, and it's always longer than you think, right? And so I can give you an example of the best case scenario where we just had a paper accepted in Public Administration Review with some co-authors in Denmark, Martin Baekgaard, Julian Christensen, and Lene Aaroe. And basically, it's a theory paper. So we didn't have to go out and collect data. And it's about the relationship between human capital and administrative burden. And so it was also part of an existing framework that we built over the course of the last 10 years. So the paper itself got written really quickly. Julian, in particular, was interested in this topic. And once we pulled it together, it just made great sense. And I think we started talking about it last spring. So the
In
spring of
the spring of
2000, yeah,
2019.
2019,
Yeah.
and it got accepted quickly, and so it should be out, maybe later this year or the start of 2020. That is by far the best case scenario, but it's also built upon lots and lots of prior intellectual work that we've done.
Yeah, like that
Right.
went into the book. You know what I mean? Like, so it's a bit erroneous to sort of say, oh yeah, the publication was really quick. It's like built on.
So it looks quick, but it
It
wasn't.
wasn't. Yeah,
Right.
I think
But
the variance is high, right? I mean, I think Don's right. Like, it always takes longer than you expect, and the variance is huge, and in part a function of whether the area is new to you or whether you've been accruing a large body of work in there. Like, the bigger the body of your work in an area, the quicker each subsequent paper goes on average. But the variance is so large, and it also depends on your co-authors, like how many like whether it's just you, whether you're working with multiple co-authors. I think the important answer to that is high levels of variance.
Yeah. And do you already have the data, right? Because I think if you're in the Pam referred to a paper where she had a research idea and she had to collect really complicated data to execute that idea, and that took years to do. Even if you're doing a survey, now turnaround times on surveys, if you're doing online surveys, have really collapsed so that you can collect data relatively quickly. But that doesn't work for all projects. But if, you have to do an IRB process that can take months. You send out a survey, maybe it takes months to get that information. It can take between 1 and 2 years between you initially submit something to a journal and when the paper is accepted. And let's say it doesn't get accepted in the first journal or the second journal, then you sort of keep adding more and more time to the process. So when everything works right, it can, things can work really quickly, but it's more normal, I think, to think about any project you start as something you should still be willing to stick around for 5 years from now. Which again is why it's really important that it's a topic you actually care about rather than something that you think, this will be an easy publication and then I'll move on to some other stuff.
Okay. I'm trying to think through when, thinking about papers I've worked on, what's the longest I've actually worked on one of them, and I think it was 9 years. But that is definitely, I would hope, the exception rather than the norm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had the first survey experiment I didn't really know what I was doing, and I think I maybe collected data in 2007 or 8. It wasn't until 2015 I got the paper published. So, it's it can take a while.
I think that's it, though. Like, that's sort of an important lesson, which is, I mean, a lot of this is just about persistence. It's about submitting that grant over and over and over again, submitting the paper over and over and over again. I think getting used to just keeping at it is sort of the most important thing and also the hardest thing. I think in terms of doing this kind of work.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's true of really productive scholars is that they're efficient in their efforts, right? So if they write a paper, they don't let it go until it gets published. And so that there are very few papers that I've written that I eventually just said, I'm just going to give up on this. But that means not letting the paper fall into a file drawer and stay there forever. It means just figuring out what you need to do with it next to make it attractive to the next journal and shipping it out again. And that's not easy work because it's dispersing to be told that your work is not good and doesn't meet the standards of a journal. And I think in particular, when you're younger and starting out, it's difficult to separate criticisms of your work and criticisms of you as a person. And so that's one thing that just gets easier over time, is externalizing criticism, so that, if you get a rejection, you just say, okay, I have to set some time aside and work on this again, rather than roll around on the floor crying, as I would have done in the first couple of years.
I definitely saw him do that. No, yeah, right. And also there are always these stories that people have, right, about the paper that got rejected at 7 different places. And then it ends up somewhere, and it ends up being one of their most cited papers. Like, this is one thing that's actually nice about Twitter, is like you see a lot of people talking about experiences like that. I actually had a similar experience like that. This paper that, we initially tried at a somewhat lower ranked journal, got rejected, and then the person that I was collaborating with was like, well, let's just try it at this higher ranked journal. And to me, this was very early in my career. To me, that seemed, why would you do that? We did it. It got accepted. And it got a conditional accept on the first submission, which is obviously one of the few I've ever had. That's unusual, right? So I think that's you really have to understand that there is a certain amount of randomness in the process. And sometimes, people are going to be not quite right about the reviews, or the reviews are going to push you to think in a way that further clarifies what is actually a really good and interesting paper, but you just hadn't quite pitched it right. I think that's part of it.
It's funny that you kind of, well, I suppose not really funny, but since you mentioned Twitter, I think the two of you are probably the most active people that actually follow on Twitter. And I can't fully kind of figure out how you manage to actually be successful at what you do while also still spending the time it takes to kind of do what you do on Twitter. So my kind of curiosity is, how do you kind of pursue, or how do you manage that work-life balance between everything else that you do career-wise with what you do at the house, with the public engagement that you also both do as well?
So, this is a good question, and I think it's actually a question we should talk more about at conferences, in the same way we talk about things like how to get a paper published, right? Because part of what we encourage faculty to do now is to have a public profile where they can talk about their work.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to know with social media that content and that platform is designed to be addictive, right? There are designs in the software that you're consuming that compel you to keep checking and rechecking content all the time. And so being on social media by itself is not in itself any great measure of success or virtue. It just means, maybe you're just addicted to this thing that's designed to be addictive. And, I certainly would say I probably spend more time than I should on social media. With Twitter in particular, I think I've gotten better about certain things. So, I do not generally respond to people who reply to me. That's sort of generally a waste of time unless they're positive replies. And the thing I would say I think is really quite good about it is that it does offer you to think about not just a platform for your work where you say, hey, I just had this paper accepted in PAR, which I think is the default, right? People will sort of say, I'm at this conference today, or I had a paper accepted. And I think that's sort of a base level minimum, but it's also not terribly interesting to most people.
Right.
Right. And so I think you have to explain to them why your work is interesting. And one thing I think Twitter has been really good for me in doing is to look for examples in the news of where administrative burdens is playing this really important role in policy outcomes, or in some cases where performance systems are misfiring badly, and then to frame that problem from a public administration perspective to an audience who maybe wouldn't always think about those topics in those terms. And so I think it is quite nice in helping us to explain to the world oh, hey, this is actually a public administration problem, and here's why you should think about it in those ways. And then finding people in different communities who are receptive to that idea. And they might be people from think tanks or from disciplinary departments, or people from other countries that you're normally never going to interact with. But at least helping to create some sort of virtual communities of people who are sort of interested in the same things that you are. Um, so I think the more energy I've invested in that part of being on Twitter, I think has been quite productive. Not everything I do on Twitter is productive by any means.
Yeah, I mean, Don is a bit more productive on Twitter than myself, but I actually would sort of say, like, that's the part that I found useful professionally, is I've definitely kind of interacted with different people than I would have otherwise, like even other academics. It's been a good platform to get certain kinds of work out there, or get people paying attention to it. So yeah, I've actually found it quite helpful. And I don't find it that hard not to, like, if I don't find it that hard to, like, turn it off. Like, it doesn't really bother me that much. It's not like I'm like, oh, feeling like I have to get on there or something. So I think mostly, actually, at the end of it, I found it actually kind of useful professionally.
I think there's definitely an aspect of, most of us come from departments where there's only really you who focus in a certain area. So having this immediate engagement with other people at other institutions who are also interested in the same thing is helpful.
Yeah.
But I probably fall between the two of you in terms of I'm not fully addicted, but I also will have a hard time not checking it occasionally. And so if I'm on vacation or visiting family, I will delete the app from my phone specifically to keep me off of it. So I probably reinstall it a good 2 or 3 dozen times a year whenever I come back home.
That's probably a good practice.
Yeah, that is a good practice.
One other thing I'd add about that is, there are also some risks of being on social media, especially if you're in a public institution and you say something off color, or you compare some political figure to a member of the Third Reich. And
not that either one of us has ever done that, but
not that we would do that, right? But I know multiple colleagues who, because of things they've said on social media, or because of things where students have sort of elevated what they thought was problematic practice on social media, it's become really problematic for them. And I think that people are generally quite cautious about what they say on social media, which, there's some measure of self-censorship there. That is probably wise when you're at the pre-tenure stage, and certainly when you're a PhD student on the market, because I don't know if people do this, but I can imagine hiring committees certainly looking at people's social media and maybe consciously or not responding to what they see on that rather than responding to the candidate's work.
The last thing I'd say about sort of an advantage to Twitter that I've seen is, so I do tend and have, ever since I was a grad student, worked around a lot of economists. And one of the really interesting things, I think, within kind of econ Twitter is the ways in which women in economics have organized themselves. From my vantage point, it looks like a lot of it happening on Twitter in terms of pushing back against what's kind of a tough discipline for women, I think, in terms of gender inequality issues in the discipline. And so I've seen a lot of really, really interesting organizing around that. So I think there are these pockets where it's actually been quite valuable around some issues.
Yeah, the community building part of it has been, I think, really great, and it gives you access to people that you didn't know existed, or you didn't know had common interests with, in a way that I think is hard to imagine using virtually any other technology.
I think you asked a broader question too, though, about how you kind of balance. I mean, how you're balancing broadly kind
Right.
of work and family. And I think that's something, especially people in dual career couples really struggle with quite a lot, right? Because, both Don and I work quite a bit, but we also have 2 kids. And I think there are a few things I'd say about that. So one thing is, I think this notion that people put out there that they work all the time. I'm working at midnight and I'm working all throughout the weekend. And I think that's I think that's not a narrative that we should be pushing. And I would say for myself, that's something I explicitly try not to do. It certainly has happened. Actually, last night I spent more time working than I typically would. So it's not like I never do it, but I make a point of trying largely not to do that. And that when I'm spending time with my kids, I'm spending time with my kids in the evenings, for example, or late afternoons and evenings and on the weekends. I think one of the blessings of these jobs actually is the flexibility that we have embedded in them. And that has been just so profoundly helpful, I feel like, in terms of balancing kind of work and family. And sort of as a kind of woman in academia, I'd also say as I've gotten more senior, I've gotten a lot more explicit about saying, for example, oh no, I can't I can't attend late afternoon seminars by and large because we have responsibilities to our kids. So like at Wisconsin, for example, all the stuff was held in the middle of the day, all talks and meetings. And it was actually very explicit why that was being done. It was to make it easier to kind of balance work and family. So I'm just a lot more sort of, I don't conceal the fact that I'm not doing something because I don't, because of some kid related issue. I've gotten a lot more vocal about just saying that. And it's partly something you can do, I think, when you have tenure and you're more senior. So I think that's a really important example for more senior people to project to do. I think both men and women should be saying those things more vocally and more frequently, because I think it improves the environment then for everyone. And it doesn't mean you're less there are periods where you will be less productive. Like if you've just had a baby, you will be less productive for a little while. You know what I mean? Like that's reality. But on average, especially a lot of the accommodations I'm thinking about in terms of like when you hold seminars or doing things like that, a place like Wisconsin, for example, there are very few people who would say that's a place where people are unproductive in the social sciences, but it's a place that very explicitly organized schedules and ways to accommodate families. So it does not have to impede productivity. It just makes the environment much more inclusive. And I think as a consequence, really helps to reduce kind of gender inequalities around caregiving, around kids and things like that.
I think one of the problems we do have is we don't really talk about work-life balance very much within the field. And so you have instances where we kind of encourage you to publish your parish and you take that on and we kind of ingrain it in PhD students. And so they get off in their careers and they've kind of lost the individual self because everything has been about that work environment.
Yeah, it's a tricky topic. I remember reading an interview, I think it was with Adam Grant a couple of years ago, and he's been phenomenally successful as a professor at a business school, and he was reflecting on his success, and partly he said I just work a lot, and he's fortunate to have a family lifestyle that allows him to do that. And so there are different types of messages you can send to junior faculty. And so I would always say you have to have outlets that are not tied to your professional career so that your personal identity is not completely wrapped up in that. At the same time, those people who tend to be just phenomenally successful probably have engaged in some of those sacrifices, or they have a situation in their life where they're able to devote themselves dramatically to their professional life. Um, and so, you want to sort of give accurate information to students. I think the sort of risk for them, though, is being, if they see models of people who are working 60 or 70 hours a week, um, in particular earlier in their career, working a lot helps, but I also think how you work matters a lot, right? And so
Right.
if you're doing 60 hours a week, but you still haven't figured out how to write an abstract or how to frame a theory, then it doesn't really matter how much time you spend on the problem, right? But it is a sort of tricky problem, and I think you can probably tell from my response I have some ambivalence about this idea of work-life balance, because I also work a lot, and that's probably partly why I've been successful, and it's also come at some cost, right? Because I used to read a lot of novels when I was younger, and I just don't do that anymore. If it's not a book on tape I can read or listen to in my car, I'll just will not listen to it. Whereas I think Pam is actually much better than I am at being able to switch off and during the weekend not feel the compulsion to pull out her laptop and to read books and to find other avenues. That's something I've probably struggled with a little bit.
We are kind of running towards the end of our time, so I do have kind of one last question for the two of you to kind of think about and answer, which is, if you were to be kind of thinking back on your career and giving advice based off of your experience in your career to a PhD student or a junior faculty, what would that advice be?
So I would say to read Michael Granovetter's work on the strength of weak ties. One thing that, as I look back, I think I figured out is that there's no real substitute for having personal connections. Um, and they don't have to be strong connections, but knowing people who work in the area that you work in or that you aspire to work with, building connections with them can have real long-term payoffs. And a lot of the consequential interactions I had in the field were partly just happenstance, right? So I remember being at one public management research conference and meeting Sanjay Pandey at an event that Jim Perry held at his house. And it was really from there that we started working together, and we had very fruitful collaboration for a fairly long period of time. At some other point, I was at the PMRC in Syracuse, and I sat down beside Simon Kelmer Anderson of Aarhus University. And it was really from that I started to have this long-term relationship with scholars in Aarhus that has been, absolutely wonderful for me in the last few years. Um, and so both of those were initially quite weak ties, and just resulted from the fact that I was at these conferences, happy to meet people, willing to find out what other people were working on and see if there's an overlap between my interests. And I think this also extends to the professional world as well. So one of the things I did as a PhD student was to spend a couple of summers interning with the World Bank. And a lot of the professional connections I've made among the practitioner community stem from that period of time where I was in Washington, D.C. I got to meet people, share my work with them. And so when I graduated, they knew who I was, and they were receptive to hearing what I was up to at that later point in time. Um, so those networks of connections, I think, are fundamentally important. They're really important right at the start of your career. And I think just introducing yourself to people, finding peers who are at the same level and are interested in the same topics you are. So it's not just senior scholars. I think that's a great way to sort of build networks which become a form of capital that you can draw on throughout your career.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely good advice. Sort of, it's somewhat related to what Don's saying, but I also think just finding really good collaborators, that certainly has been incredibly important to me. The sort of set of people that I really enjoy working with, that I think have made kind of the work better. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of papers that I have that I could have just done on my own. But I think for most projects, or in, in similar fashion, like maybe some of my collaborators on those papers could have just done on their own. But nearly all of the work that I have that's collaborative is clearly so much better because, there were at least a few people involved. Like that, it's not. I think we have this sort of idea in academia that it's like the sole authored papers are so important, and they are, in a practical sense, particularly within some areas of the social sciences that people expect to see that. But I think the truth is the most pivotal and important work increasingly is not sole authored, it's co-authored.
Right.
And that kind of so finding those people, and I think that's the trend basically going forward. So I think basically finding those people that you work well with is really, really important in terms of thinking about the long term over your career. And I think the second thing is something that we already just sort of mentioned, which is about the just sort of basic combination of persistence and being sure that you're really interested in what you're doing. Like not taking on work because someone else thought it was a good idea, or even because the field deems that's an important question or work. You really have to be interested in it in yourself, in part because the only way you succeed is just persistence, is just really keep submitting the papers over and over again and submitting those grants over and over again. So you really have to care about what you're engaged in, the research that you're engaged in, because if you don't, it's just impossible to sustain that level of persistence, especially in the face of the kind of failure that we all regularly get or have.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.